Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
The story in the Bible of Noah, his ark, and the global flood is a paradox. It's a paradox because two conflicting things are true about the story. On the one hand, it's one of those stories that is part of the Sunday school curriculum for many. At least it certainly was in the fundamentalist churches of my youth. I'm sure many of our listeners will recall that story being told using flannel board cutouts and colored pictures that feature happy animals walking off a cute little ark and a happy Noah with his arms stretched out towards the sky where there was a happy sun and a happy rainbow. It was such a fun and happy scene that we would color with crayons and glue sparkles onto it. It's such a great story that Answers in Genesis have built a huge theme park around this story. Ken Ham's Great Ark Adventure. We did an episode a while back with someone who worked behind the scenes there, David McMillan, in episode number 31, and he told us about how he's since radically changed his mind around that story and the Christian faith. Again, check that out at episode number 31. But I called that story, told in the book of Genesis, chapters 6 to 9, a paradox because although this is often a happy staple of many childhood Sunday school programs, it also often becomes something so horribly offensive to adult moral sensibilities, such that it plays an instrumental part in the deconstruction of many people's faith. And today I would never teach it to children. It's now in the same category as the story in the book of Judges, chapters 19, 20, and 21 that we explored a few months ago in episode number 98. You see, what was absent in the picture from my Sunday school childhood, beneath the cute little ark with the happy animals and the happy Noah, there should be dead bodies of children sticking out of the mud. Dead dogs and cats and other pets, and the deep scratches on the side of the ark where desperate fingernails of mothers tried to grab on for safety while they tried to keep the heads of their babies above the waves. I'm sorry if this offends you, but all of those things are also part of the story of Noah's flood. We just don't tend to talk about those details. Scott, what was your experience with the Noah flood story when you were a kid, and did you struggle with it later as an adult?
Yeah, on both counts, I agree. Yeah, as a kid, sure, just like most kids of my generation, I remember those flannel things. Remember those flannel panel things? You know,
Yeah.
And we used to stick the different things on there. Oh, yeah, very much a story of hope, the rainbow, and that'll never happen again, kind of thing. And if people were pictured, they were pictured as being so wicked that they deserve the flood, kind of thing. You know, like know that was more or less the gist of it. So, yeah. And then, of course, later on in adulthood and so on, it just became very, I guess, troubling on a number of levels. Certainly, scientifically troubling, like, how, really seriously, the whole world was flooded and, those kind of questions. And then, theologically, it raises some very, very troubling and challenging issues. God changing his mind, God regretting, things, and he regrets he made man, and then he regrets he did the flood. Right. So what do you do with those kind of things? So yeah, I'm with you.
Now, fortunately for me, for the faith I'm trying to reconstruct, I've since learned that there are good reasons for us not taking this story literally, and we may have some discussion around that word, literally, and to see this story in its entirety from a very different perspective. And to help us with that, we brought on a guest today, Dr. Dustin Burlett, who made that story the focus of his PhD studies at McMaster Divinity School here in Hamilton, Ontario, in which he applied a new literary tool called rhetorical critical analysis to capture a new perspective on this difficult story. And he's just released a book which captures much of that doctoral work with the title Judgment and Salvation, a rhetorical critical reading of Noah's flood in Genesis. So, Dr. Burlett, Dustin, welcome to our podcast.
Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Dustin, you were on a whitewater rafting tour on the Colorado River with people from Answers in Genesis, and you heard their story of how the Grand Canyon was carved out by, the receding waters of Noah's flood. That must have been quite a trip, quite an adventure.
That's right. And I'm actually glad that you brought that up. You see, I was in the middle of my doctoral work on Noah's flood, and right before I went there, I got invited to go to Toronto to go to a private luncheon and dinner meeting with Ken Ham and an inner circle of people when Answers in Genesis Canada first opened. So, of course, I show up, found Ken Ham, and I walked up to him and I said, Ken Hamster, I'm actually in the midst of writing a review of a book that you contributed to with Zondervan, The Lost World of the Flood by Tremper Longman and John Walton. And it had to do with, 4 views on creation, evolution, and intelligent design.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, well, what's your dissertation on? I said, well, it's on Noah's flood. He says, well, who's impacted? Tremper Longman, John Walton, C. John Collins. And he says, well, what do you think about answers in Genesis? And I had to be honest. I said I hadn't given them much thought.
To Ken Ham, to his face.
I did. I said I hadn't given him much thought.
Wow.
And he said, well,
wow.
I'm not an academic. He says, I'm not an academic, and I'm not in a position to adjudicate your academic credentials, but I know some people who are. And he said, can I have your contact information? So he gave me his business card, and he said, I'll be in touch with you. And of course, I'm like, no, you won't. In my mind, I'm like, of course you won't. This is a fairly high profile individual. So I got my picture taken with him and I put it in our photo album, and I forgot about it. Well, not that long after, I get a message from one of the members of the Answers in Genesis Circle, Terry Mortensen. And he says, Dustin, I want you to consider going to the Grand Canyon on a rafting tour with our Christian leaders team. And he said, and here's a list of all the people who have actually done the same boat tour. And you look and it's like pretty big names. There's some high profile names on there. But of course, I asked him, well, who's the biblical scholars? Who can I trust? Who's on this team? And what's the point? Well, Jeremy Lyon was one of the names that was brought forward. And of course, I was very familiar with his work in Qumran because of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the flood of Genesis and the creation accounts. And of course, Tremper Longman and John Walton at the end of The Lost World of the Flood, Jeremy Lyon's book is one of the ones that they endorse. And I thought, well, if Jeremy Lyon's there, I'll go. And I had no idea what to expect. So we're on the boat, and one of the guys, his name was John Whitmore, he's the geologist. And he says, can any of you tell me about the Coconino sandstone? And of course, I stand up and I say, yeah, I know a thing or two about the Coconino, not in my arrogance, okay, in my ignorance, because I had done quite a bit of research and study. I had read The Bible Rocks in Time by Young and Steerley. I had read everything actually that Davis Young had published. I was familiar with the book by Carol Hill, and I just finished this review. Now, it's very important to understand that one of the other authors who contributed to that volume was Stephen Moshier. And one of the things that he brought up within his short chapter was the Coconino sandstone. So I started talking about the Coconino sandstone. And he says, would you be interested to know that the data that you have received as far as the actual granular structure of the Coconino sandstone, when you grind it up and you look at it under a microscope, that the granular structure that you have been taught is actually factually incorrect? And it says, would you also be interested to know that the angles of the crossbeds that you have been taught and that are published in all this literature are inaccurate? I said, I would be very surprised. But by the time I was done my Grand Canyon tour, I got back and I started messaging some of these people. So Tim Hevel is a fantastic scholar, and he's got great rebuttals against John Whitmore and the Coconino sandstone. And Stephen Moshier has fielded a ton of my questions. But I was absolutely dumbfounded that after having completed how much of my dissertation already and having completed how much work already within this field through good evangelical publishing like Kriegel and IVP Academic and Zondervan and you name it, that I've been fed incorrect factual information about such a key component, because the Coconino sandstone is considered by many to be the greatest evidence against Noah's flood. And here, the very facts, the things that you can't change, like the granular nature or the angle of the incline beds, I was taught wrong. And so when I went back to my peers, I began to discover that there was a lot more information than what I knew, and some of the information that I was being fed wasn't accurate. It really began to shape and impact my understanding of the academy and some of the things that I had bracketed aside and counted as being, those intellectual dum-dums. I realized I had to sit up and pay attention because they weren't who I thought they were.
Was the information, the inaccuracy on the side of the conservative view, the supporters of the flood, or the inaccuracy on the secular side?
The portrayal of the material was inaccurate, irrespective of your predisposition. And what I mean by that is simply this. The way that I understood it is that not a lot of field work had been done on that particular sandstone. And so, according to the pre existing models, they hypothesized that the sandstone would look like this or would have these particular angles. But the field work and the field research actually indicated something else and could possibly have overturned some of those presuppositions. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is the implications of that research and, of course, the origins. How did this come about? And that's where it goes sometimes beyond the realm of operational science, to go back to the Ken Ham, to hypothetical or historical science. So a person can't really disagree or argue with the granular nature of the Coconino sandstone, and a person can't really argue with the angles of the crossbeds. But beyond that, there's so much to argue about. And Tim Hevel and Stephen Washira has done a fantastic job. But of course, John Whitmore has done his own work as well.
No, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the Coconino Sands because that's just one piece of geological evidence, and there is a lot of evidence that is against the flood. But you say this one is important because it's a major piece of evidence that wasn't conveyed correctly. None of us here are geologists, so we're not going to get into too much details. The argument is whether those sand grains were deposited by wind, a dry condition, or underwater, a flood condition. And the data seem to say that it was, in fact, deposited underwater. But that could have been a local flood in North America, which says nothing about a local flood in the Middle East, let alone a global flood around the Earth. This isn't, to me, evidence for a global flood around the Earth.
And that's why, Luke, I love that you say that, because I think that it's so important for people to recognize that this doesn't always mean that.
Exactly.
And so this idea of trying to extend something, well, that becomes increasingly more challenging and increasingly more difficult.
Right.
One of the things that this discussion obviously indicates is the almost infatuation, maybe, with the kind of historical reality behind the Genesis account. That seems to be a question that evangelicals are particularly concerned about. And I say evangelicals because I think that's true, that other faith traditions aren't as concerned about it because they take the story in different ways. But it leads back to the whole issue of biblical inerrancy and so on, that if you don't believe that, then you're questioning the Bible's accuracy and so on. So it seems to link back to that fundamental issue. And I think, if I remember right, Dustin, you can fill me in, but Walke himself got in a lot of trouble, right, at Westminster for questioning some of those things.
Yeah, he isn't the only one who's experienced challenges when a person's confession of faith comes into conflict with their convictions.
Yeah.
And of course, that's one of the challenges that I find. So at the introduction to my book, I make it very, very clear that I wish to have no part of anything where we are not doing good scholastic academic work. This isn't an attempt to marginalize something based upon a preconception or pre-understanding.
So the two fundamental issues that we're bantering back and forth here are, on the one hand, the historical nature of the account. Did this occur, or was it global, and so on? But the other is, beyond that, the theological implications of the account, right? Which are probably in some ways more challenging and in some ways more disturbing,
right,
than the historical things. And Dustin, your work in that book is aimed at a different understanding of that theologically, right? That using rhetorical critical analysis, you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but that this isn't primarily a story of judgment. It's really more a story of hope. And maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. So one of the images that I often use in my classrooms when I come to effective biblical interpretation is a triangle diagram with a base with a peak that looks similar to a pyramid, but it's not three-dimensional. And on the bottom left is history. So it's the events that have transpired in space and time. Now, you mentioned about evangelicals and fundamentalists. Obviously, the biblical archaeology movement was funded predominantly by confessional evangelicals. And the real question, of course, was if Jericho was not razed, R-A-Z-E-D, is our faith in vain? And of course, that's a really good play on words, because if Christ was not raised, is our faith in vain?
Right.
And so the question is, of course, the question of correspondence or historical referentiality. So these events are purported to have taken place within space and time, but we have no record of an event apart from its context in a piece of literature. So the other base of the triangle, the one is history, the other one is simply literature. And that's where genre comes into play, because genre triggers reading strategy. And to misidentify the genre of a text is to misidentify what can be pulled from it. So when we go to our mailboxes, we automatically sort things according to a genre automatically. Same thing within scripture, but it often takes a lot more nuance and a lot more flavor. What I try to do in my book is I actually bracket out the historical component to a large degree. I recognize that I'm not a geologist, and I recognize that though there are certain implications that do involve things about the flood in this world, I try to leave that to the experts that I am not. But I also wanted to go beyond the literature component, because even a person like Robert Alter is really able to do a good job of the finer points of literature. And I recognize that's not my specialty either. I'm not a linguist in that way. But the apex or the climax of this triangle, so the bottom left is history, the bottom right is literature, the apex or the climax is theology. And that is where I wanted to center my book on, is that it's more than literature, it's more than history, it's theology. And to treat it as anything less than theology is actually to do an injustice to the text. And in fact, you could even be majoring on the minors.
Now, could
Yeah.
I just clarify? History is important, you say, but you have put it on a par with literature, and then above that would be the theology. You're trying to make a theological point based on what may or may not have happened historically and how you might read the literature. If we were, for example, wanting to look at theology of race, of forgiveness, compassion, of brotherly love, and we did that based on what actually happened during the American Civil War, or we did that based on what happened in Star Wars, may the force be with you and Luke Skywalker, that sort of thing. In both cases, you have a battle, and you can talk about forgiveness and war and love and race, what have you, but it takes on a whole different meaning when you base it on what actually happened in the Civil War and what we've learned from that and what the repercussions were than you would if you just base it on a fun reading of Star Wars.
That's really well said, Luke. And when I was reading the Harry Potter series, the amount of real life contemporary issues that came up through that reading is huge, but it's a fictional world and it's a fictional environment, and
Right.
therefore it has a whole lot less weight. Now, can you perhaps rephrase what you were saying? Because I think I know where you're trying to go with that, but I want to make sure that I've heard you correctly. Can you perhaps rephrase that differently in terms of what are you trying to ask me?
Well, okay, I think we can't push the history aside. We have to look at the historicity. I think the fact that there is so many lines of evidence that say this flood could not have been a global flood, that would be based on scientific grounds. But then on moral grounds, I really can't see that this was a flood sent in punishment of wickedness on the face of the earth. So for those two reasons, I just can't see this story as historical. Now, if we want to agree that, okay, if it was made up, if it was created to bring out some theological principles, fine, we can proceed on that. But to the extent that we say this is based on the flood actually having happened, I have a lot of problems with that.
Is it a
Yeah.
binary situation? Does it have to be either or? It seems to me there's a historical reality behind the story. There's something happened, right? That it's not somebody just didn't pull it out of the air, and we have good evidence for that in the sense that we have other flood stories in the Mesopotamian world from that time, right? So it sounds like to me like there's a historical reality there, but then this story is taking that historical reality and turning it into a story, a story that says some things about God and the things we've talked about. I don't know, Dustin, where do you think along those lines?
Well, there's a lot to unpack with what you've said, Luke, and I
Yeah.
don't think that I can do justice to absolutely everything that you have said right at this very moment. So I'm going to tackle the one thing. I don't want to pretend that somehow in my bracketing out of the historical component of the flood, that I'm somehow trying to denigrate that in any way, because I believe that you're exactly right in what you say. If the flood was in fact a fictional made up story, who cares that this is what it communicated? But if in fact it is true that this event transpired within space and time, then it makes all the difference in the world. Now, when I read The Lost World of the Flood by Longman and Walton, they refer to another book by Ryan and Pittman called Noah's Flood, the new scientific discoveries about the event that changed history. And what they've done is they've created models of these different flood events that have happened. And they say this could be an inspiration or a model of what Noah's flood could have looked like. And so there seems to be enough scientific evidence that there's good understandings of how a flood like Noah's flood could have occurred using real modern day contemporary non-even evangelical science. But what both Tremper and John state is that the event itself is not inspired. It's the recording of that event as delineated in Scripture. And I think that that's where the difference lies in terms of, yes, the event itself, and Tremper and John state explicitly, yes, it happened. And so I do believe that there was a Noah's flood. I do believe that a flood event happened.
Now, can we just
Now,
define what you mean by there was a Noah's flood? Was it a regional flood in Mesopotamia, which they had almost every year, and sure, every 10 or 20 years there was a really big one, maybe every 100 years a cataclysmic one. But was it restricted to that region, or are we talking about a global flood in the sense that we would mean that? So for example, you went on that whitewater rafting tour in the Grand Canyon, and somehow there's being a link being made to that and this thing that happened in Mesopotamia. I don't see that link.
right. And so, of course, one of the big things that comes down to is our definition of terms.
Right.
Global versus universal. Most people mean the same thing. But of
Mm.
course, the question is, of course, did they understand globe the way that we would have understood the globe?
Right.
The other question, of course, is, are we using hyperbole and rhetoric, or are we actually using historical veracity language? And so one of the things that my book did was it created a more solid methodology for both identifying and mitigating hyperbole.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I find is incredibly important is to learn how to identify where is the universalistic language being employed and where is it not being employed in terms of, is it being employed in terms of actual geological elements or phenomenological elements, or is it being applied to theological statements? And it does seem to be the case. It does seem to be the case that the text wants to be understood as a universal global flood of cataclysmic proportions. Because when a person reads it through the New Testament lens, it states very explicitly that the world that then was perished. And even what I find is of interest is you mentioned, Luke, about how there was very common floods within the ancient Near East. I don't believe that anybody denies that. But one thing that I do find very interesting within the book of Hebrews is where it's written that Noah built an ark, but he did not yet see. That was his faith. If there was common floods, what did Noah not see that inspired him to build the ark? And I do find that to be a real sticking point for me, was if this flood was just one of many common occurrences, what distinguished Noah's work within the book of Hebrews and even Noah's work as a whole from anything else? And so I do find that to be a very interesting food for thought. What was it that Noah didn't see that everybody else would have seen given a geographic flood?
Well, okay, so the wording is it destroyed the world as it then was. I think that's another way of saying as they understood it. And that's how I understand a lot of people will characterize the Noah's flood, that it destroyed the world that they knew, but they didn't know about the North American Indians and the people in Tasmania. And so it was a large flood, which in their eyes, in their minds, it covered the world, but they never traveled more than 1,000 miles, right? So
Yeah.
if we're fine with saying, okay, it was a local flood in that sense, a geographically local flood and not a global flood in the sense that we mean, that's fine. That takes care of a lot of my scientific problems with this story. But equal with the scientific concerns are the moral concerns, the whole idea that God well, even to the extent that God would send the flood, let alone just stand back and watch this flood destroy everybody in that region of the world because some fraction of the population was exceedingly wicked. I find it really hard to believe that everybody alive in that region was so desperately wicked that they deserved to die by drowning. Even including little children, invalids, people who couldn't do anything, literally couldn't do anything, let alone do desperately wicked things, and that they deserve drowning. I have those moral concerns as well.
So I want to be very clear, Luke. I do believe that there was a global deluge that literally resurfaced the face of the earth to the point that it was not a geographically isolated event. I do believe in a universal catastrophic flood. And I do believe that there has been increased evidence of that in different ways. And I don't want to get too much into it. But part of the reason that I find it to be of great interest is our understanding of global plate tectonics and, of course, the idea of what's going on there. But that's neither here nor there. But I do advocate and I do stand behind a global catastrophic flood that left behind great geological import.
I just simply want to say there are so many lines of evidence, scientific lines of evidence, that range from genetics and ecology, all kinds of biological evidence, the engineering of this thing, the geological evidence, the historical evidence. By that I mean, Chinese Empire and people in South America and in Tasmania. There's just so many lines of evidence that say there wasn't this global flood. And so I guess I'll ask you then, you're convinced that there is this global flood in the way that we mean global. That's based on, I'm sure that's based in large part on the Bible, but what scientific evidence would you say that you would hold that to be?
Well, again, I'm not a geologist, but one of the things that I do find quite interesting is when they trace out certain layers, they're cross-continental. And so they can, oh, go ahead.
Well, that's actually, I've heard the opposite. And in fact, I was reading that in those articles I was reading up on with the coconino
That's right.
sandstones. They were characterizing all these different layers. They characterize it like you walk through a forest and you have leaves on the ground. And so the leaves they're all flattened and overlapping, but they overlap in different ways. But none of
That's
those
right.
leaves stretch from one end of the forest to the other. They're just all different layers that overlap in different ways. And there is not a layer that you can stretch across the whole globe and show and point it out in the Grand Canyon and in Australia and in Germany and in China. That just isn't the case.
Right. And of course, some people would come back and say fish discover water last. And so it's, of course, a hard thing. And so I think that when you and I are both coming at it, I don't want to be a presuppositionalist versus an evidentialist, but I have enough inklings to believe in this particular position.
Okay,
And of course, I believe that my scriptural interpretation would lend itself to it.
right.
But I have no problems with you being where you're at too. And I see that as being very valid and I have
Good.
no problems with that.
Okay,
So
good.
Dustin, if it was unequivocally demonstrated, like I mean beyond reasonable doubt, such as the issue of evolution, as an example, maybe 100 years ago, Christians could make arguments that there were still a lot of holes in Darwin's theory that need to be filled in, and he himself said that. However, over the last couple 100 years, the evidence has piled on, especially with the advent of modern microbiology, genetics, things like that, where we can see evolution. We can literally see, we don't need a fossil record because we have the fossil record right in our genome, right? So yes, you can still deny it. That's, you can deny, you could be a flat earther, right? But it's pretty.
I have friends who actually are flat earthers.
Yeah. So yeah. So my question to you is, if the geology becomes that compelling that there's just no denying that there could not have been, now I think Luke would say, and I think I would agree that we're already there. You don't think we are, but let's say we did get there. What would that do to your understanding of the Genesis account? Like, would that be a devastating blow to you as far as the authority of Scripture?
As an academic, I have the wonderful privilege to be able to hold at arm's length certain things and ask myself, have I rightly interpreted the text?
Right.
Or am I simply applying my own mindset?
Right.
I'd have to really go back and say, have I misread this text to that large of a degree that it really be like that? And so, of course, I would be captive to the scriptures, and I have to really ask myself, how could I misread it that poorly? And
Mm,
I have to go back and find justification for it and
mm.
see if the text actually could lend itself to that interpretation.
And I guess that's what I'm asking is, do you think it could? Like, for example, there's no doubt that from the author's perspective, it's global and catastrophic. I agree with that. Like, I think that's absolutely right. But that's from their perspective, right? And their world, their globe was not our globe and our world. I mean, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament says that the gospel had gone out into the whole world. Well, what he really meant was it had gone out into the Mediterranean world, which was his whole world, right? But we know for a fact that the gospel had not gone out into the whole world in the first century. We know that nobody can argue that, right? Because we know that natives were over in North America and so on and so forth. So we accept the fact that Paul's speaking as a first century Mediterranean man, and that's really not much of an issue. So could you not see it that way?
I appreciate that you mentioned that up because I feel like that's often used quite a bit. And I don't see you using it as a red herring at all because it's like just in Joseph, the famine was in all the land, right?
Right,
But it
right.
wasn't just, but it's like, it's often with respect to ness. So with respect to the famine, this is what happened. With respect to the gospel, this is what happened. But the with respect to ness of the flood is the heavens and the earth. And so
Hmm.
it's very odd sometimes the witness testimony of the with respect to ness is in a way that lends itself beyond a mere border description. And that's where going back to the method is so key because what counts as evidence? So the method is often the magic. And without an effective method for both detecting and mitigating hyperbole, it simply gets absolutely rampant.
Yeah.
And so when you put the same constraints for both detecting and mitigating hyperbole to the gospel or to the famine or to even some of Jesus's usages of hyperbole in the
Hmm.
parables, a person could begin to discover that the universalistic language within the flood has taken on a different scope and a different nuance. Now, of course, in Zephaniah, the same reversal of creation is being portrayed. And so you simply apply the same methodology for both identifying and mitigating hyperbole as Zephaniah as you do to the flood, as you do to anything else. And the same categories that seem to indicate this is mere hyperbole. And so one of the titles of my articles was Oriental Hyperbole. You've got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
So it's like, what do you mean it's just hyperbole? And of course, that's the key thing is the methodology for both detecting and mitigating hyperbole. So of course, when you go back to these other texts and you apply the exact same method, you begin to discover that this is of a completely different breed. It's a horse of another color.
So you don't think the author's not being hyperbolic?
I believe that there could have been no other way to have communicated it. And when not to get too technical, but even within the New Testament, the fact that there's of course there's an Old Testament technical term for the ocean above, the mavul. So of course when the waters above were divided from the waters below, there's this cosmic ocean. And of course, the flood is meant to be portrayed as a cosmic undoing of creation. That in the beginning, when God separated the waters above from the waters below, he has now undone that and is now a recreation of the earth. Well, it uses a very technical term. It's the mavul. And so it's like the Lord sits enthroned over the mavul. He sits enthroned Lord forever. Well, the New Testament has a very unique terminology that is only in reference to Noah's flood. And it's what we term cataclysmic. It's a cataclysmic event, and it's to be differentiated and categorically defined in a different way.
What I hear you saying then, Dustin, is that you were talking about Paul referring to the spread of the gospel around the world, and the with respect to ness was with respect to the gospel. You talked about Joseph and the famine with respect to the famine. And then your evidence for this flood being a global, as we would mean the term, a global flood, was with respect to what the scripture says about the heavens, that this was a flood that had impact on the heavens. And just a moment ago, the New Testament references to this being a cataclysmic thing, which means more than just a local flood. All of that to say that what you're doing, Dustin, is saying it's because the Bible says we're going
That's
to put
right.
that up against science, and then you force people like me to say, well, now I have to choose science or the Bible.
Oh man, Luke, I would never want to ever say something like that to you because, well, see, you are a scientist. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? You are a
Yeah,
scientist.
and I'm also a believer, and I've I have some training, a little bit of training in theology.
Well, of
I'm
course.
emphasizing that I'm not just a scientist.
Right, of course not. I know that you have a substantial amount of theological education and underpinning. You invited me as a guest on this show not to advocate all perspectives, if I'm not mistaken. You
Right.
brought me in as a guest on the show to talk more or less about my perspective.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, Dennis Lamoureux has done a phenomenal job of outlining how a person can believe that the Bible and the beaker are in no ultimate conflict with each other from a purely scientific perspective. And Dennis Lamoureux has done an excellent job, not just in the Bible and ancient science, but in all of his work to help people come along in this journey. And Dennis Lamoureux has done things that Answers in Genesis or some of these other faith-based groups simply don't have the capability to do for most people.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I have no reason to believe that the Bible, when rightly interpreted, or science, when rightly interpreted, will ever be in ultimate conflict with each other. That's my conviction. So, my conviction is that ultimately there's no final conflict between what we see in God's world and what we see in God's word. Now, other people have different mediums and different ways and methodologies of trying to actually lay that out. But there's no biblical theologian worth their salt who would ever want to say to you, Luke, you can't be a Christian and you can't believe in God's word unless, and then you put the ... some of the things that you have said. I'm trying to say that Dennis Lamoureux's faith has inspired my own, and he and I could not be more polar opposite.
Right.
Well, and in case I wasn't clear, what I'm saying is I am fully aware of many, many lines of scientific evidence which say this was not a global flood. And then a few moments ago, Dustin, you were saying that there was biblical language that implied that this was a global flood. And now I'm forced to choose the science which says there was not. Or do I hang my hat on the fact that the Bible says there was? That's what I meant by I'm now forced to choose.
You could be forced to choose if you take a particular direction with the text and with the science. You could be
Right.
forced to choose.
Right.
But that is not the only evangelical Christian confessional option on the table.
Okay.
So that's why we have Zondervan and IVP are so good at these. 4 views on science and creation, 4 views on Genesis and history. So it's like, in my opinion, I believe that when the scientific evidence will come down and will shake down, it will provide conclusive evidence towards a global catastrophic flood.
Okay.
The reason why I believe that is because I believe that we, in our own understandings, cannot see the forest through the trees. I really do believe that.
So
Now,
Okay.
go ahead, Scott.
Well, I was just going to say that if I put on Luke's hat for a second, or I pretend to be a scientist, my concern would be that that's all fine and good. I have no, what you're saying, Dustin. However, if then we constrained science, if we said that, okay, we believe the Bible, it's a universal flood, and therefore we believe it is a universal flood, and so our scientific analysis should then be impacted by that. That should be our framework for doing our scientific analysis. That can become quite problematic, right? Whereas
I would see that as incredibly problematic. You see, the whole idea is if 2 people are going to ride a horse, which one is going to be in front? And you never want to put the cart before the horse. Now,
right.
One of the things that I believe is getting out of the vicious circle into the hermeneutical spiral, where if we have a presupposition, we must allow ourselves to re-examine, does the text really say this, or does science really say this? And of course, Luke, nobody's trying to change your mind. You say the science proves unequivocally this.
Right.
Nobody's trying to change your mind. And I have reason to believe that there's enough big tent umbrella evangelicalism that you don't have to.
Okay.
Right.
But if the text seems to indicate in unequivocal language, it must be this, then I have reason to believe that if we look, and it might not even be looking hard enough, it might not even be looking long enough, it might actually be something else altogether, we will find evidence of it.
And we can pursue this further, but I'm wondering if instead we should take a step away from the scientific evidence or lack thereof about the flood and talk about the
Right.
other reason why I found this story to be so hard to take, which is the moral side of the story. I have struggled with the morality of this story. To me, it describes a God who's vengeful and angry and wrathful and capricious. It doesn't paint a good picture of God whatsoever. And yet, you have a different perspective that comes out of your rhetorical critical analysis. So maybe we should talk more about that at this point.
Sure. So one of the things that I found incredibly intriguing was the first article that I had ever published was on that very thing that you said. Was God angry at the flood? And one of the things that became very clear to me was actually the text doesn't say that he is. Now, it uses very similar phraseology within the other portions of Genesis with the rape of Dinah. It's a very unique phraseology where they were highly offended because nothing like this should ever be done in Israel. And it states that they were angry. But the text of Genesis actually doesn't make mention that God was angry. And one of the things that I actually really came across with was the flood being the tears of God. Now, you mentioned the word remorse or repent or regret. And that's another thing that I began to really lean into was what did it mean that it repented God to have created the earth? And one of the things that I became increasingly aware of was how much it grieved God to his heart, how much humanity had made a mess of his world. Now, when I read the ancient Near Eastern epics, morality plays a very little role in there. But when I read the Bible, morality is first and foremost in the narrative. Now, you
Hmm.
talk about all these people being swept away and the little children and all those things. What I find really intriguing about the text is how clear the text makes explicit the violence, the injustice, and the suffering that humanity is actually doing to each other. For lack of a better way to put it, they're cannibalizing each other. And so one of the things that grieves me when I read it was look at the depravity of our own humanity. And when I hold up the mirror, am I walking in the way of Cain, who killed his brother Abel? Or am I walking in the way of Joseph, who had the opportunity to exact vengeance on his brothers, to give them all their just deserts, but said, am I in the place of God? And then chose not to exact vengeance on his brothers. And so when Joseph says, am I in the place of God? He knew explicitly, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Whereas Lamech says, no, vengeance is good, and I am in the place of authority to do that. So I will not just kill a man for wounding me, I will kill a man for bruising me. He has an escalation of violence that ultimately led to the Hamas that overthrew the world. So both Joseph and I believe the book of Genesis recognizes the place and location of retribution theology or retributive justice. In other words, injustice or justice. And Joseph himself said, am I in the place of God to be able to take life? And Joseph knew it wasn't his place to be able to do that.
Dustin, you made reference to people like Lamech, who just killed people because they looked at me sideways, or to Cain, who killed his brother. And there were people like that then. There's people like that now. And of course, we sometimes talk about people being like Hitler or not. But there was still a lot of other people who were not at all like that. I just find it hard to believe that every adult alive in that time was so desperately wicked. But even if we say they were, you can't tell me that a 5-year-old or a 2-year-old kid was doing such desperate wickedness that those kids deserved to die by drowning. I just don't, I can't see that. And then for God to solve the violence problem by doing this violence against humanity, there's a little bit of a paradox there.
Now, when I read the book of Job and I look at the wisdom literature of Job, the key question is why have all these things happened to me if I didn't even deserve it? And of course, the whole back and forth and banter back and forth is, well, of course you must have deserved it. You must have sinned in a way that you couldn't even imagine. And of course, in the New Testament, we've got the disciples asking Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus simply says, neither, but this might be done so that it might glorify God. Now, there is God's glory, salvation through judgment that Hamilton has written, and I actually didn't really engage with it that much. Now, I don't disagree with you, Luke, that the flood can leave a bad taste in a person's mouth. And in fact, if it doesn't, I have reason to believe that you're probably not reading the same Bible as me. It's a very disconcerting book, and I believe that we are right. But one of the key questions that I believe it also raises is what does it even mean that the wages of sin is death? What does it even mean that the soul that sins shall die? What is even going on with respect to an affront to a holy and a sovereign God? In other words, what is biblical theology?
Yeah, there are many other examples in the Bible of the innocent suffering for the sake of the guilty. I mean, you look at the Exodus account. I remember when I saw as a kid the Ten Commandments for the first time, how disturbed I was that all these children were being killed, just because their parents didn't put a sign on their door because they weren't Jews. I mean, talk about a racial cleansing. And did those young children deserve that? Jesus pronounces judgment on Jerusalem, and 70 years later, the Romans come and absolutely destroy it, killing almost everybody there. Did those people deserve that judgment because of a few in the religious elite that had Jesus crucified? There's just tons of examples of that. So I guess all I'm saying is that I think all through the scriptures, you have this issue of that people suffer for the sake of others' guilt, for the sake of others. And I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not happy about it. But what I'm saying is the flood story isn't particularly, in my mind, particularly unique in that way. It's in good company.
It is unique in the sense that if we're going to take the story as some want to portray it, it was one that involved the entire earth, everybody dying in a horrible way.
Okay.
And more importantly, God being behind that. He's the one who's actually opening up the floodgates and just standing back and watching people suffer horribly. That's a picture that I don't think is deserving.
So are you looking for some way of resolving the in a sense the repugnance of this text to modern sensibilities, that somehow we can either through a different perspective, like the rhetorical critical analysis, or maybe in your case, Luke, we just reject the story and we just say, well, somebody made this story up and they were having a bad day, and the things it says about God, we really can't, in light of the whole Bible, it doesn't fit with the kind of God that the rest of the Bible or most of the Bible portrays, the compassionate, the loving, the graceful God, right? Can't be. Yeah, go ahead.
I do see a disconnect there, the compassionate God and this story, totally.
Yeah.
And as far as the whole making up goes, I don't mean the guy had a bad day and just made up the story. I totally can see how there was a whole series of floods, and then maybe one particular one that was especially bad, and that became the kernel of a story, and the authors tried to bring up some theological insights from that story. I can totally see that, but the point being
I can't see that.
No, I know.
Because when I read my ancient Near Eastern texts, you can't get the flood story based off of that. And so all the ancient artifacts that we have would never provide a text like this to save its life. They could never compose it. They would never compose it.
So I'm not sure what you just said, Dustin. If you mean the actual specific details of the story might be different between the Babylonian versus the biblical account. Okay, the specific details.
The entire philosophy and worldview, not just of the deity, but of the origins of the flood, its necessity, its reasons, its impact, and its theology, even with respect to the bow, none of it would have ever came about through ancient Near Eastern flood stories.
I can see both cultures experiencing floods all the time, and maybe they experienced together one particularly bad one, and the Babylonian priests and authors wrote up a story about Marduk and Tiamat and rewrote the story in a way that made sense to their theology, and the biblical authors doing much the same thing. So there's a kernel of truth. I can see that, and I can see how the biblical authors would expand upon the story to pull out theological insights. And this then emphasize what I'm saying. These stories in the Bible are written by humans, and they can still be divinely inspired. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago, what that I mean by that. They can be divinely inspired, but that doesn't mean that God was telling them the details of the story And I find it really hard to believe that God was telling him, here's why I sent that flood that killed everybody in such a horrible way. I can't see that.
See, I think Luke, you and I find that so challenging and troublesome. See, I've read Peter Enns' Inspiration and Incarnation. I've read Kenton Sparks' God's Words, Human Words, Sacred Words, whatever, like the big one and the little one. And in fact, I've even read almost all of Peter Enns' new works too. But when Jesus says, as it will be in the days of Noah, so it will be at the days of the coming of the Son of Man, I mean, that's a biblical interpretation of an Old Testament event from the lips of Jesus.
Yeah, but couldn't it also be something like a youth group leader telling his kids, you know how in Star Wars when Darth Vader did this and then that? And it doesn't mean that he believes that Star Wars is a real story. He's taking an image that the kids in this case relate to, or the biblical author is taking a story that their audience related to and drawing out a truth from that.
I appreciate that you mentioned that. One of the textbooks that I used to use in my class was by Tremper London and Richard Carlson, Science, Creation, the Bible. And one of the things that I thoroughly appreciate about that textbook was the definition of myth and a J.R. Tolkien style of definition of myth and the grand meta-narrative. But one of the things that really seemed to have persuaded the Inklings like C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien was this was a myth that actually happened. Jesus rising from the dead was a real myth. Now, I have good reason to believe that if you want to take the approach of, hey, this is just a youth group leader quoting Star Wars, that you are free to that interpretation. There's no question that you are free to that interpretation. But the question is, are you doing it with consistency and validity and integrity to the text as it wishes to be read from a canonical perspective? In other words, are you actually resting the text to such a degree that you have mutilated it beyond all recognition so that it's actually no longer even the biblical flood story that we're talking about? Or is it simply an invented story that actually isn't even worthy to be counted as equal to Scripture? That's the key. And once we begin to rest some of these things out, I have good reason to believe that it really muddies the water. That's where genre analysis, canonical analysis, and all these things come into play. I don't believe that when Christ is referring to the flood story or when Peter's referring to the flood story in these ways, that it's simply the same thing as, hey, we're quoting Star Wars. It's not the same.
Yeah, that's true. I think that I don't have any doubt that Peter and Jesus saw this as a real event, that happened and as a global event. I guess
I can even agree with you on that, by the way.
Okay.
That they saw it, that they
Yes.
understood it that way.
Yes, yes.
Well, yeah,
And
yeah.
now, these branch off into so many other things, right? But depending on how you view the incarnation, in other words, Jesus self-limiting of himself, his shedding of
the kenosis,
the canonic, the whole canonic thing and everything. Could you argue that he's a first century Jew and he believes what most first centuries Jews believe?
Right.
And that's, I think, pretty clear. And he doesn't know everything either, because that's also clear, right? That he says that himself, that he knows as much as the Father has revealed to him. If you believe that Jesus is self-limitation and is canonic, in the canonic relation and so on, then he takes it, he believes it as they do, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's, in a sense, correct from a modern perspective. It could be that it reflects his understanding of that time. And I know that causes all kinds of issues. Don't get me wrong.
I just want to come back to a word that you used, Dustin, way back in the beginning of the interview. This story really anthropomorphizes God. I mean, God is sorry that he made humans. He repented of making humans. And then later he repents. He's sorry. He said, I goofed. I shouldn't have destroyed them. He recognized that his solution was not effective because he did it because there was too much evil in the world. And then after the dust is settled, literally, there's still just as much wickedness in the world. So his tool didn't work. And then there's another really silly little detail that kind of fits into this. That whole idea of after the flood, Noah has a barbecue. He has a sacrifice, and God smelt the wonderful smell of the barbecue, and his wrath was appeased, or something like that. This whole story reduces God to some very human level.
All right. Thank you, Luke, for bringing that up because I appreciate you doing that. Now, obviously, we recognize that traditional scholarship has divided the flood story into the Yahwist and the priestly sources.
Right.
And one of the ways that they had done that division was based upon the anthropomorphizing of Scripture and the anthropomorphizing of God in Scripture. That was actually one of the characteristics that they used to define that text. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, but believe it or not, I have good reason to believe that you have not rightly understood the first chapter to my book because I engage very heavily with the flood being a wash and why I believe that there's good justification against the very things that you have confessed. And I think I do a very good job there adequately describing that. So I would challenge or at least invite you to reconsider your presuppositions and perhaps reread that chapter.
Well, would it be possible to explain what you're referring to? Because the listeners haven't read the book. So,
Well, that's fine, but perhaps they will. But one of the things that I would try to encourage them to do is to reconsider this idea of the triviality of this sweet smelling sacrifice. Now, we can't reduce that to, you call it a silly little detail. There's an awful lot to unpack there, actually, and to trivialize it as a silly little detail is bordering on something close to almost blasphemous if a person can actually rightly interpret and understand it. Now, the big question is, of course, is how can such a great God be so easily satisfied? That is the question that is being raised. And if a person answers that question wrong, God is petty, he's vengeful, he's vindictive, he's a bully, and God is a boy with a magnifying glass who's burning the ant. A misunderstanding of something as simple as Noah's sacrifice can change an entire perspective on the entire feel of the flood.
okay, I will have to reread the chapter, but I do remember in other readings years ago about the Epic of Gilgamesh and reading the Babylonian story has such a parallel to this. The gods swarming around a sacrifice like flies.
See, that's
But
hilarious that you see that there's such a parallel because I see such discontinuity. Because in my reading of the ancient Near Eastern text, the gods themselves are terrified, one, of the flood. So, one, they're not in control. So when I read the biblical text, God is divinely sovereignly in control. He opened the floodgates of heaven, he closed them. Whereas in the ancient Near Eastern epics, they are so afraid that they're cowering in fear and running away. When I read the ancient Near Eastern epics, they are all thirsty and hungry and thinking that they're about to starve and are hovering like flies, swarming around the sacrifice. It's an acknowledgement of their own incompetency that why in the world are we even worshiping these beings as gods? Whereas when we read the flood text, it's a completely different story in terms of the soothing, sweet smelling sacrifice, as opposed to a God who actually needs the sustaining nature.
But Dustin, for me, the parallels between these two stories is that in both cases you have a god sending a flood to kill all the humans, Enlil in the case of the Babylonian story, and you have the hero of the story, Utnapishtim for the Babylonians and Noah for the Hebrews. Both of them are leading their animal cargoes off their respective arks and then immediately making a burnt sacrifice to their respective deities, and those deities being soothed or comforted or calmed by the aroma, and then the deities giving a sign of an oath that they're now making, a necklace given to Gilgamesh and a rainbow to Noah. To me, there's just a bit too many parallels between those two stories. But that having been said, I think we've stepped away from the point I was trying to make, which was basically that the story anthropomorphizes God by portraying God saying, oops, I made a mistake by creating humans, and then, oops, I made a mistake by trying to destroy them, and then recognizing that what he had planned as a solution was a failure. God made another mistake, because there was just as much wickedness after the flood as there is before it. Nothing changed except a lot of dead bodies in the mud.
No, see, that's not to put too fine a point on it, Luke, but that's the very thing that in my book I try to counter. That's a mischaracterization of the flood. It's actually a mischaracterization and even a misreading of the flood. And if a person comes to the flood with that reading, I would want a person to come to your conclusion. I would want them to agree with you And I would want them to stand with you. But the point that I'm trying to make is actually that's a misreading of the text, and that is not what the text is trying to say.
So maybe at the heart of the problem, we didn't really talk much about your book. Your book has a lot of Hebrew words and the
That's
understanding of the
fair.
Hebrew words. And I'll be honest, when it came to those, there was many pages where there was a lot of actual Hebrew writing, like the script was in Hebrew, and then definitions and what these things mean in different contexts and what have you. I was not able to digest that. That requires a grad level course to digest that part of your book, and that was a lot of your book. So I obviously then missed the point. But my understanding of the story of Noah has God saying, oops, I made people I shouldn't have, and oops, I shouldn't have destroyed them. You want to say something?
And I want to say something. So it's like I use the term that it's often portrayed that God is some kind of mad scientist concocting in the laboratory, and you use the word oops, and it's a good word. Okay. But the point that I'm trying to actually make is that's not the function of the flood at all. And so within the first chapter, which actually uses far, far less technical language, far, far less technical Hebrew, because all the Hebrew words can be glossed over because it has their English equivalents right beside it. You can actually gloss all the way over it, and you can actually systematically read through God as the divine, cosmic, mad scientist and why that's incorrect. And of course, I have to lay my cards on the table. I draw fairly heavily upon Mark Boda's understanding of covenant and the function of covenant. So the function of covenant is to make kinsfolk out of those who are not. So humanity, within their origins, did not need a covenant because they were already within that family. But when they broke covenant with God in terms of eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they became in an out of relationship structure. They lost that kinship structure that needed to be recalibrated. And so the Lord provided an opportunity to recalibrate the brokenness of the relationship between humanity and God through inviting covenant. And that's why Genesis 9 is so critical to understand within its ancient Near Eastern culture, because there's no precedent for the bow and there's no precedent for the covenant that actually extends as far as that flood was, that much and even greater. There's no precedent. And that's where I believe that it's not a human story. The human beings of that day and age would have never invented Genesis 9. Genesis 9, I believe, is the greatest evidence for the flood account, in fact, being divine revelation and not human invention.
I'm just curious. The word in English there is, God repented. So you've, Luke, have kind of, you say oops, or you've interpreted that as God feeling like he had made a mistake. But another way to look at it would be that God is not feeling like he made a mistake. He's just extremely sad that his creation has become this violent cesspool, and he's in a sense he's brokenhearted about that. It's not so much
He's
that
absolutely brokenhearted. So
it's like
the system.
I don't regret having children. I regret creating my kids, but they can break my heart. They can cause me a lot of grief.
Well, actually, Scott, you've hit the nail on the head. So when the curse is pronounced upon, you will be the serpent. You're going to eat dust all your life. Well, what he's basically saying is you are defeated, Satan. You are not going to be victorious. Okay, the God of peace will soon crush Satan underneath your feet. So another one bites the dust. Okay, it's symbolic language. But when it says that in pain you will bear children, well, the truth of the matter is that language and imagery there is it's a boy, and the way that you can remember that is it's a boy. And what is this boy going to do? That boy's going to break your heart, because what are your children going to do? Cain's going to kill Abel. Children will be a pain and they're going to break your heart. And it broke God's heart. So the first article that I published was on the doctrine of divine impassibility, which is basically what were God's thoughts concerning the flood. And I have good reason to believe that through the metaphor, through the imagery, the flood is the tears of God.
Yeah, I know. It's too bad that we don't put this on video, because the look on Luke's face right now is.
See, So here's what was going through my mind right at the moment that you said that, Scott. So I forget the details of the story, but I remember as a kid reading some story about how the North American Indians explained the stripes on the back of a chipmunk. And it
Mm.
had to do something to do with a bear taking a swipe at the original chipmunk and left a scar, and now all chipmunks bear the scar of this encounter between a chipmunk and a bear. I don't see that as the origin of those things. So now when you talk about, you mentioned the bow in the sky, the rainbow, which there was no precedent according to the story, and you made reference to the curse on the snake and the curse that is Eve is told, if your son is going to break your heart. To me, these are stories that people crafted because it brought out a meaning that was important to them. It made sense of their world. You know, where did the stripes on the chipmunk come from? Where did the rainbow come from? Why do snakes crawl on the ground? And in this case, the biblical case, you can draw theological principles out of it. And in that sense, it's divinely inspired. But to
Mm.
say that all of those stories actually happened, the stripes on the chipmunks, I'm not going to say it came from a bear.
Yeah,
So,
no, I think that's true. I mean, I don't believe, especially when you're dealing with Eden, and a talking snake and things like that. We're dealing with very different kind of genre and language there, and I don't think it's meant to be taken. But the theological things that are being wrestled with and taught,
right.
I would agree with
And,
you.
and I'll
Yeah,
accept
and
that.
that's where Dennis Lamoureux is at pretty much too. In his, now, I don't think Dustin would necessarily be completely there, although maybe to some extent. But I'll leave it to him.
Well, see, Luke, one of the things that I want to explore a little bit more is to what function and purpose. Okay, going back to Hebrew just a little bit, one of the things that I find very interesting is that most people who learn Hebrew only want to focus on very few select passages of the grammar. So the grammar might be 300 pages, and they only really want to engage with about 20 to 30 pages of that. When I look at scripture, to what end and to what purpose are these things recorded? It's a big question, because one of the things that I continue, or at least I feel like I'm continuing to hear from you, Luke, is, well, no. Well, no. But one of the things that I continuously ask is, well, then why is it even there? Why do we even use the term inspiration?
Well, Lucas asked that question.
So there's two different questions there. So why are they there? I'm fully convinced that a lot of the stories in the Old Testament, especially Genesis 1 to 11, and the stories around Abraham, are there because it was an ancient Semitic people who later became the Israelites wanting to understand their origins in the context of the
That's a good
Babylonian
answer.
captivity.
That's a
In
very
the
good
context
answer.
of the Babylonian captivity. So
Right.
that's why it's there. And then the second part of your question was something about, well, how do I see it as divinely inspired? I think I can accept the idea that there is a divine being, let's call it God, who inspires humans to look at the story and see, does this make sense to you? Now, I'm repeating what I said in the Judges 19, 20, and 21 story, but here God's saying, what do you think about the depravity of the human heart in the case of the flood story? Um,
See, Luke, when I listen to you, hear me out when I say this. When I listen to you, I would have to be honest. Your faith astounds me. Now, I know that the title of the podcast is Recovering Evangelicals, but I don't know if I would have the faith to continue to even be engaging in the Bible, or even to be remotely entertaining the way that you do, if that was my image of God and my image of the Bible. And it astounds me, your faithfulness and your tenacity and your integrity to do this. Because if I believed what you believed, I would have thrown it out a long time ago.
this requires another episode. I'm only trying to make sense of a Christian faith that I think there's much value in. But the Christian faith that was handed to me as a child makes no sense, and I'm trying to hang on to the parts that do make sense, that I want to hang on to, which is essentially the gospel message. And we have done episodes on what the gospel message is, and it is not turn or burn, and it is not, you know, anti-homosexuals and gun rights. The gospel message, which is again the evangelion, is something completely different, and I'm 100% behind that. And I think the Bible helps us to understand that gospel message, and that's where my tenacity comes from. But to say that I see the Bible as telling us, where rainbows came from and why there's now death on Earth and why humans are so evil, that's where I start to have problems.
Oh, sorry, Luke. I may have misspoken in a way that I didn't intend to misspeak if I in fact did that about the bow. Circumcision was very prevalent within the ancient Near Eastern culture by the time Abraham was circumcised.
Right.
It was the significance to that sign that changed.
Right.
Now, the bow took on a huge, huge significance in light of the flood. That's the significance, that there is now a sign for this covenant that I'm making, not just with the creatures coming off the flood. Now, here's the question going back to the global flood, okay? It's with all of creation, with all the earth. Now, in my book, I quote somebody who is a non-young earth creationist, John K. Griffin. And one of the things that he does is he states very explicitly, he says, how in the world could a geographically located flood provide a universal sign of salvation? And I think that there's a lot of validity to his logic and to his argument that I actually explore in a little bit more depth in a footnote. But he says, does it not make more sense that the universal nature of the salvation has to be in proportion to the universal nature of the judgment?
Yeah, I've heard that argument as well. The fact is that their believing it was universal, I think, is critical. Whether it in fact was universal, I don't know if that's critical. Now that may sound strange, but in other words, regardless of whether there was in fact a universal flood, the story certainly is predicated on that. I agree with that. The story sees it as a universal, global, cosmic event, like you said, a recreation event. I've no doubt about that. But I'm not bothered that much by whether that actually happened or not. If it happened, if scientific evidence shows compellingly that it did happen at some point, then great. Right now, it certainly seems to be very much in the other direction. But the story is teaching us something, right? It's teaching us something about God. It's teaching us something about the universality of salvation. It's teaching us things about hope. And I can still get that from it. And I think that's where a guy like Dennis Lammerer is kind of at, and I tend to agree with him, although I'm not saying that position is completely without problems, because it's not. But all these positions have problems, right? It's not like there's one position that solves all these issues. So that's why we have this podcast, right? Because it's important that Christians, I believe, and non-Christians, if they like to, can have this kind of a dialogue, where we, even if we don't come out agreeing, that we're exploring these things, Well,
honestly. I think it's absolutely ludicrous to believe that three people, and of course more, our audience, with such diverse backgrounds, would ever come to an accord to this high of a degree about such diverse materials.
Yeah, right.
So we have gone on long, and you're right. We have not covered all the bases, and we don't have the time to do so. Dustin, is there any last words that you'd want to get on the table before we do draw a line under this and put a bow in our sky?
I guess I want to encourage you to reconsider the flood and reconsider God in light of the message of salvation and redemption, and not just judgment and wrath.
Okay, with that, I thank you so much for coming on, Dustin. We really appreciate your time, your expertise, and your experience with this story.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you guys as well.
Okay.
Thanks, Dustin. Thank you.
You bet. Bye, Scott. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. Or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.